About 10 years ago, this Master System 2 stopped working, and now I feel like I owe it to bring it back. So how did it stop working anyway? Well, once upon a time, when I was a teenager, I just learned about console mods, and right off the bat, I have a hot tip for you. Do not try console mods that require soldering without a soldering iron. I was just trying to do an LED mod of all things, and long story short, I shorted the voltage regulator and that was it. The graphics became a garbled mess, and because I wouldn't leave it alone, I made it worse, and from then, it did nothing. Like a working Nintendo Wii. A few years ago, when I actually had a soldering iron, I replaced the voltage regulator, but that didn't change anything. The console was out of action. Here we are now though, with some actual soldering experience and better equipment, having another crack at it. I actually got this soldering iron the other day, and it's a much more reasonable wattage. That's another hot tip. Once you've got the top of the console and you've got past the shielding, you should see the circuit board. If not, then I've got some bad news for you. Immediately, I must confess that I have already replaced this chip up here. I think it's a RAM chip. Looking at the service manual, it seemed like a good place to start, and well, this was the result. The chip was swapped out with one from my other working SMS2. I didn't record swapping that chip out because I did not expect to see any results, to be honest, but believe me, I was really happy to see this. This was the same garbled mess I saw all those years ago before it completely died, so hope has been restored, for now. I proceed to take the rest of the screws out and completely free the board. Underneath here you can see some old dodgy solder points from when I was replacing the voltage regulator years ago. Looking around online and back at the service manual, I've narrowed the issue down to 3 chips. These 2 RAM chips and the dreaded Sega 315 chip. Really hope it's not this one, because the pins on this one are really close together and at an awkward sort of zigzag pattern, and I don't want to have to deal with doing that shit. So I get to work with the 2 RAM chips. I got this flux pen and some solder braid at the same time as the iron, so you'll be seeing me use those for the first time today. Right now, in fact. I added flux along the pins on one side and added fresh solder to the old joints to make it easier to remove. In comes the braid. I have tried braid before when repairing the Atari Lynx, which was absolutely shit, except this time it seemed to work quite well. I still find it a bit finicky, but I really haven't used it properly before. You can see it absorbing the solder, but as it does that, the braid gets quite hot, which shouldn't surprise you really, but I found out the difficult way, which seems to be a trend for me now. After doing the same to the other set of pins and going back over them to make sure that the wires are free for the pins to move around, I remove the chip. I then clean the area with some IPA and a cotton bud. I then repeat the exact same process for the other RAM chip right next to it. With editing, it doesn't seem to take very long, but for me at least, that's not exactly the case. This can be quite time consuming. I go ahead and remove the same chips from the sacrificial Master System 2, which I don't need to show as I just did it with the other one. It's exactly the same. The best part is finally getting them soldered into place. The apprehension kicks in as I put the system back together, which in hindsight is an unnecessary action since I'm just testing the thing. The results are in, and the judges say there's no fucking difference. Oh. And it's the same when I try it with a cartridge as well. Look at those pins. I don't want to deal with that. There are 64 of the fucking things. Zigzaggy little shits. Now, I really didn't need the camera in my way for this one, so I did the brunt of it off camera, my apologies. But even then, the steps were the same, and eventually, I get it out. Yes, it looks a little mangled in places, and this is from the sacrificial system, so I really cannot afford to wreck it now after all this. On the other system, I found that the braid wasn't getting all the solder out, so I broke out the solder pump, and that got just enough more out so I could remove it properly. I did record putting the other chip back in its place, but my giant head got in the way, so never mind that. Here it is now soldered in, but that didn't come without difficulty. I spotted a damaged trace that the chip was covering, and I patched it with a little jumper wire. Soldering onto the inside pins is not recommended if you prefer feeling good about yourself, because look what I did to the pins around it. I did check that all the connections were good and that there were no shorts, and then after another clean with IPA, it was time to test it again. Oh! I genuinely did not expect this. Shoot! I promise you, on the inside I was jumping for joy. So why did I sacrifice a perfectly fine Master System 2 for this one? Well, the first reason is because this one is a Sonic the Hedgehog variant. You could argue that I should have just swapped the BIOS chips, but you can't. The Sonic BIOS has extra pins, making it impossible. The other reason is because this console is the first console I ever actually owned. It was given to me in 2006 when I was just an 11-year-old wondering where our Mega Drive 2 disappeared to a few years prior. This was the first time I saw a Sega console that wasn't a Mega Drive 2, and that's where the research began and when my interest for retro gaming started to take shape. I got a Mega Drive 2 later that year for what I still considered to be the best Christmas I ever had, featuring myself looking really dopey. Enough blabbing. If you enjoyed the video, that's fantastic. I'm thinking about doing a 60Hz mod to this console, and you bet I'll do a video on that if I do. And as always, I'll be back in 16 bits. Gimme.
So you got it working yet?
Oh yeah, that's right, yeah.
So I can have the other one then, yeah?
Well, no, not really, because I had to take chips out of that one to get the other one working. But if I get the old chips in it, it's not going to work anyway, because they're the dead ones. I mean, you've got the money, you can probably get one yourself, they're pretty cheap. And the games aren't too